The Language Fire, the epic story of Aiden Gomez, Ivan Zhang, and Nick Frost, founders of Cohere. The story begins, as many revolutions do, not in a boardroom or a laboratory, but in the quiet restlessness of a young mind that refuses to accept the world as it is. Aiden Gomez was 19 when he first began to feel the weight of the impossible. Not the kind of weight that crushes, but the kind that demands an answer. He wasn't a prophet or a prodigy in the conventional sense. He was simply someone who could not stop asking questions. His childhood in Canada had been filled with puzzles, logic games, and the irresistibly strange feeling that the universe was speaking a language he could almost, but not quite, decode. The problem wasn't that the world didn't make sense. The problem was that it made too much sense, and yet no one seemed to see the patterns the way he did. By the time he entered the University of Toronto, the city's gray winter skies became a kind of backdrop for an inner world that glowed with graphs, nodes, and probabilities. He stumbled into machine learning almost by accident, taking a course that introduced him to a group of researchers who were beginning to tinker with neural networks. What the others saw as algorithms, he saw as living systems, imperfect, hungry, evolving. He stayed late in the lab every night, his fingers shaking from cold and caffeine as he wrote code that felt less like programming and more like building new forms of thought. One night, while everyone else had gone home, Aiden stared at a model that refused to converge. The numbers spiraled in strange directions. Something about it felt off. He tilted his head and whispered to himself, "It shouldn't be this hard for a machine to pay attention." The word attention lingered in the air like a spark. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, quiet, uncelebrated, unnoticed, would be the seed of a revolution that would change the world. Across the city, another young mind was moving through his own restless pilgrimage. Ivan Zhang grew up surrounded by electronics, disassembling devices to see how they worked, often failing to reassemble them, but learning something every time. He wasn't interested in theory for theory's sake. He wanted to build. He wanted to feel metal and silicon bend to human intention. He and Aiden met through a mutual friend, one of those seemingly trivial events that becomes monumental in hindsight. Ivan's first impression was that Aiden was brilliant but chaotic, like a scientist who had misplaced his lab coat, but somehow found the universe's equation. Aiden, meanwhile, found Ivan's grounded practicality refreshing. Where Aiden soared, Ivan anchored. Where Ivan constructed, Aiden imagined. Their partnership formed instantly, like flint and steel sparking into flame. But a third piece would soon fall into place. A man who had already walked the paths the two younger founders were trying to find. Nick Frost had worked at Google Brain, the research lab that had become synonymous with AI's frontier. He had walked the same halls as Geoffrey Hinton, the godfather of deep learning. He had helped build neural architectures that had already changed the world. And yet, like many who stand inside a giant, he had begun to question whether the future could really be built inside an institution so large it threatened to swallow innovation whole. Nick met Aiden at Google Brain, where Aiden was interning. The age gap mattered far less than the intellectual resonance. They talked about models, memory, scaling laws, transformers, and the shape of thought. Aiden and Nick spent long nights scribbling on whiteboards, debating whether neural networks should learn like children, like ants, like languages, or like viruses. They laughed at the absurdity of it, and then quietly realized they might be onto something the world hadn't seen before. Then came the moment that would become legend, the birth of the Transformer. In 2017, Aiden co-authored a paper titled Attention is All You Need. The title sounded almost playful, but the content was a seismic rupture in the history of AI. At the time, models struggled to remember long sequences. Recurrent networks choked on complexity. Translation systems tripped over nuance. But the transformer proposed something radical. Instead of forcing a model to process information step by step, like a human reading a sentence, Why not allow it to examine every word at once? Weighting relationships dynamically? Machines would no longer lumber through language, they would see it. The world changed almost overnight. At conferences, people whispered about the paper. Senior researchers furrowed their brows and muttered that such a simple idea couldn't possibly work as well as it did. And yet, the benchmark surged. Closed-door meetings erupted at big tech firms. Venture capitalists began circling. The future was shifting, and the epicenter of that shift was a paper co-authored by a 20-year-old. But as the transformer spread across the research world like wildfire, Aiden, Ivan, and Nick began to notice something troubling. Companies, big companies, were racing to build giant models behind closed walls. A sense of monopoly was taking root. AI felt on the verge of becoming something controlled, centralized, inaccessible. And that was when the idea emerged. What if they built a company dedicated to democratizing access to language models? Not a consumer chatbot, not a closed empire, but an independent platform where enterprises could use powerful models without losing control of their data or their identity. The idea was heresy in Silicon Valley. Most investors wanted flashy chatbots, consumer apps, viral products. But three Canadians dared to ask a different question. What if AI didn't replace people, but augmented them? Their dream took form in 2019. They called it Cohere. The name spoke to their mission, helping meaning cohere from the chaos of information. Aiden brought the raw vision. Ivan brought the architecture and engineering rigor. Nick brought wisdom and experience from the halls of Google Brain. Together, they were a complete organism. 3 minds, 3 temperaments, 1 purpose. They rented a small office, barely furnished, where they wrote code on folding tables. The world outside didn't know their names, but inside that cramped space, the air felt charged, like the early days of a band destined for arenas. Early investors were skeptical. AI startups came and went like seasonal storms. But then came the turning point. A pitch meeting where Aiden spoke not about profits, but about principles. Language, he said, voice trembling with conviction, is the infrastructure of thought. Whoever controls language models will shape how humanity thinks. If we let AI concentrate in a few companies, we lose freedom, creativity, identity itself. The room fell silent. Investors leaned forward. The wave had begun. Cohere raised significant funding, but more importantly, it earned respect. The founders built not for hype, but for longevity. They focused on enterprises, banks, hospitals, retailers, government agencies, organizations that needed AI not to entertain, but to transform work itself. While competitors poured resources into chatbots for the masses, Cohere quietly built a fortress of infrastructure, privacy guarantees, security layers, and customizable models. They embraced the idea that different industries required different language models, some optimized for reasoning, some for speed, some for safety, some for internal data retrieval. The founders often worked until dawn. At 3 a.m., Ivan would still be debugging memory constraints. Nick would be adjusting training datasets, making sure the model didn't hallucinate when stakes were high. And Aiden, still the dreamer, would walk circles around the room, asking questions that sounded naive until they revealed themselves as profound. How do we make models that know what they don't know? What does it mean for a machine to understand? How do we make AI that amplifies human capability rather than replacing it? Those questions shaped Cohere's culture. They refused to collect user data. They refused to build products that trapped customers. They refused to chase headlines. Instead, they built trust. As the world entered the AI boom of the 2020s, the three founders found themselves at the heart of a global shift. Governments asked for advice. Fortune 500 companies sought partnerships. Universities wanted their guidance. And each time, the founders repeated the same principle. AI should be a tool of empowerment, not control. The race for enterprise AI became intense. Tech giants tried to woo clients with massive infrastructure advantages. But Cohere offered something the giants could not: independence. The freedom for enterprises to innovate without surrendering their data to a behemoth. Cohere's models grew larger, smarter, safer. They released command models for reasoning tasks, embed models for search, re-rank models for information systems. They prioritized multilingual capability to reflect the global nature of language. Behind the scenes, the founders wrestled with the weight of their influence. One evening, after a long day of meetings, the trio found themselves sitting on the rooftop of their Toronto headquarters, overlooking the skyline. Nick leaned back and sighed. Do you ever think about how strange this is? A few years ago, we were just scribbling on whiteboards. Now governments want us to guide the future of communication. Ivan shook his head. I still think of us as builders. Everything else is noise. Aiden gazed at the city lights, tiny sparks in the vast dark. We're creating something that will outlive us, something that will change how knowledge flows. There was a long silence. Then Ivan said quietly, as long as it stays in service of people. That line, simple as it was, became a kind of mantra. Cohere never forgot it. As the model scaled, so did the company. Engineers arrived from every corner of the world. Philosophers joined to study language. Designers came to build interfaces that humans could trust. And still, the founders walked the halls, code reviewing, debating ethics, testing prototypes, staying grounded in the craft. The company grew into a powerhouse. Valuations soared into the billions. Investors considered the founders future titans of the AI age. Yet none of the three allowed themselves to believe the hype. For them, the true victory was not wealth, but responsibility. They saw a planet on the brink of transformation. AI was entering medicine, finance, communications, national defense, education. Language models were becoming the backbone of decision-making systems. And through it all, Cohere stood not as a kingmaker, but as a steward. Their mission was not domination, but distribution. Not replacement, but augmentation. Not centralization, but coherence. The story of Cohere is often told as a technology milestone, a startup success, a financial victory. But beneath the surface, it is something deeper, a story of three minds determined to reshape the relationship between humanity and its own language. Aiden brought imagination, the willingness to ask questions no one dared speak aloud. Ivan brought rigor, the relentless engineering discipline that made the impossible real. Nick brought wisdom, the seasoned understanding that great power demands even greater humility. Together, they built more than a company. They built a philosophy, a belief that technology should elevate individuals rather than subsume them, a belief that meaning is not manufactured but discovered, and a belief that the future is still, despite everything, a narrative we can shape. The founders often return to the idea that language is the fabric of human life, woven through stories, contracts, conversations, dreams. If language models became the new infrastructure of civilization, then those models must reflect humanity's complexity, diversity, and agency. As Cohere expanded, their models entered industries where errors had real consequences. They powered medical platforms searching through research papers for insights. They powered financial systems that analyzed risks. They powered educational tools that personalized learning for millions. The stakes grew. So did their determination. The world watched as the 2030s approached, a time when AI was no longer a novelty but a necessity. And in this new era, the founders of Cohere stood as guardians of a principle many had forgotten. That power must be distributed, not hoarded. One night, years after Cohere had become a global force, Aiden revisited the old Google Brain building where the Transformer had been born. The halls looked smaller than he remembered. The lights buzzed with a soft hum. He placed his hand on the whiteboard where he had once scribbled the early sketches of attention mechanisms. He whispered, "We didn't know what we were starting." Behind him, Footsteps echoed. It was Nick. We still don't, Nick said. But we know why we're doing it. Aiden nodded. Because language is the soul of humanity. Nick smiled. And we're just helping it evolve. Across the ocean, in a bustling Cohere office in London, Ivan was reviewing a batch of model outputs. He adjusted hyperparameters, tested edge cases, and frowned at a sentence that felt unnatural. He whispered to the model, as if it were a child learning to speak, "You can do better." And somehow, in the way only AI can, it did. By now the world had accepted that language models were part of daily life. They wrote reports, scanned legal documents, analyzed medical results, interpreted regulations, translated ideas across cultures. They turned the world into a web of interconnected meaning. Cohere had not built the largest models, or the flashiest ones, or the most talked about ones. They had built the ones that mattered, the ones that people trusted, the ones that industries depended on, the ones that preserved human agency rather than consuming it. Their story became something told in classrooms, boardrooms, research labs, not as a tale of wealth or success, but as a lesson in courage, the courage to build independently, to resist monopolies, to pursue a vision others dismissed. Aiden, Ivan, and Nick never claimed to be heroes. They still argued in meetings. They still stayed up too late debugging. They still doubted themselves at times. But they never doubted their mission. In the end, their legacy was not defined by valuations or funding rounds or headlines. It was defined by the millions of people who used AI to think more clearly, create more boldly, communicate more effectively. It was defined by the engineers who built on top of Cohere's APIs, by the doctors who found insights buried in mountains of research, by the teachers who used AI to give students personalized attention, by the small businesses that competed with giants because AI leveled the playing field, by the scientists who discovered new truths with the help of language reasoning systems, by a world that found coherence in the information overload. The epic of Cohere is the epic of language itself, a story of chaos resolving into meaning. Aiden once said in an interview, "We didn't set out to build a company. We set out to build a future where understanding is accessible." Ivan added, "And where complexity becomes collaboration, not confusion." Nick finished, "Where technology serves humanity, not the other way around." The three stood together, side by side, not as founders or executives, but as caretakers of a revolution they sparked together. A revolution that began with a question in a quiet room. A revolution that grew into a fire of ideas. A revolution still unfolding. And so the story of Cohere continues, written not in code alone, but in the billions of words spoken every day, the unseen conversations between humans and machines, the decisions, discoveries, and dreams made possible by those who dared to believe that language could change the world. When future generations look back on the dawn of the AI era, they will see many companies, many breakthroughs, many headlines. But somewhere near the center of that vast tapestry, they will find three names: Aiden Gomez, Ivan Zhang, Nick Frost, etched into the history of thought itself, not as conquerors, not as kings, but as builders of coherence. And in the quiet moments, when the world sleeps and the machines hum softly in darkened data centers, the language models whisper through their circuits, carrying forward the vision of the founders who gave them life. A world where meaning flows freely, a world where intelligence is shared, a world where language unites rather than divides, a world made coherent.